views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hey there, welcome to the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to writers and editors and journalists and sometimes filmmakers and photographers and videographers, anybody who puts stuff out about the borough of the Bronx. And this evening, we're really going to talk about, listen, we know that Election Day just happened and there's a lot to melt down. This evening, we're going to start off with Zach Williams at City and State New York, who has written extensively about state legislature, and I have something that I thought was particularly interesting, and so we're going to bring that up as well. Nice to see Zach Williams again. Nice to have you with us, sir.
Thanks so much for having me.
Zach, I do want to have you focus on the state races. I'll let the audience know we're recording this Wednesday afternoon. It's not going to air till Thursday, and the way things are moving in the presidential race, anything could happen between now and then. But Zach, just any thoughts on a general view of what has happened, what has transpired nationally?
Well, the biggest question at the state level was whether Democrats were going to win, were going to pick up 2 seats and win a supermajority in the state Senate. Not only would that have allowed them to override gubernatorial vetoes in the future, it would have also given them a leg up in the upcoming redistricting process. But as things worked out, it's looking like the Republicans actually might have regained some of the seats they lost to the Democrats in 2008. Still a lot of votes that remain to be counted, but it's looking like the Democratic majority in the state Senate might have shrunk a little bit, but we'll just have to wait and see until all the votes are finally counted.
And so the supermajority at that point would certainly be off the table. I just think that notion is very interesting, considering that, it was maybe 5 after 9 and all the networks were calling New York for Joe Biden. And usually those kinds of coattails mean that people, especially in this very fraught and splintered electorate, that people would just vote, blue down the line or red down the line. So that would be curious to me. Are you looking at any races in particular that flipped? And any idea of why they may have flipped? And in other words, that would mean that people technically would have voted for Joe Biden, but then maybe notched a Republican Senate candidate.
Well, the biggest Democratic losses appear to be on Long Island and in the Hudson Valley. These are a lot of traditionally Republican districts where bail reform has been a very controversial issue all year long, even before the pandemic began. But there is a silver lining for Democrats in the Rochester area and in Western New York in general. Looks like they picked up 2 seats in Rochester, maybe another one in Buffalo, possibly one in Syracuse. And that means 4 new Democratic senators from upstate, which kind of creates a whole new conference or group with dynamic within the Democratic conference, which has historically been divided between suburban moderates on Long Island and in the Hudson Valley, as well and New York City liberals on the other side. It's also worth noting that in addition, Andrew Gennardis lost in Southern Brooklyn, part of a wider, surge of conservative votes that appeared to really make the difference between Nicole Maliotakis and incumbent Democrat Max Rose on a congressional race on Staten Island and in Brooklyn.
I put my hand, you saw it, I don't know if the audience saw it, I put my hand on my head as you were describing this because I'm trying to make sense of it. Because as you say, normally it's, upstate versus downstate. And then, yes, the New York City suburban areas, Westchester and Long Island, are maybe more moderate. But it would appear, and I'm going to posit this because I think we're seeing this on a national level, that the urban centers, and let's face it, Buffalo is an urban center to some degree, Rochester is an urban center to some degree, that those places are now going to swing blue, whereas you could see what's going on in Long Island. Suburban areas are really turning more right-handed, so to speak. I think that whole thing accounts for what you're talking about. Fascinating shift. Right. I mean, this is really interesting for those of us who follow trends. And then, of course, how do legislators come to the state Senate, and what does that mean for, some of the legislation, whether it be single payer health care, women's rights, and all those kinds of things.
Well, I think you're, seeing something that's very real. Samara Brook and Jeremy Cooney, two Democratic candidates, one in the Rochester area. John Ryan looks like he's going to win in the southern Buffalo suburbs once all the votes are tallied. And I think it's really interesting that of all the Democrats that flipped, that went a progressive direction in 2018, Rachel May in the Syracuse area appears to be a lock for reelection, at least by a couple points, while a lot of her fellow freshman Democrats on Long Island and even in the Hudson Valley lost. So we're going to see more urban Democrats in the state Senate, but fewer Democrats overall. And the same thing is kind of playing out in the Assembly as well.
You mentioned Syracuse. I had forgotten to mention that when I talked about upstate New York, and I guess you could include Albany in that as well, which has its own particular character because of the nature of the fact that the seat of government is there. But just for information's sake, for viewers who don't understand the concept of supermajority, it doesn't appear that it's going to be in play this time. But what would or what could it have meant if, in fact, Democrats had held some of those seats on Long Island and in other places?
Well, if Democrats had won 2/3 of the state Senate and 2/3 of the Assembly, and of course they still have the governor's office, it would have made New York one of just a few states nationwide where Democrats have that strong of a hold on state government.
And let me just add, according to your article, it's California, Rhode Island, and Hawaii are the others.
That's it. Just a few states where Democrats really call the shots. That doesn't necessarily mean that Democrats all agree on the best policies moving forward, but it does obviously signal that Republicans don't matter much. As things are probably going to turn out, the Republicans are kind of clawing their way back. They're picking up a couple seats, but it's still going to be a Democratic game in state politics for the next 2 years at least.
We mentioned, and I mentioned to you just before the show, and I know you know that the Bronx has basically held serve. All the electeds, all the incumbents were essentially reelected. However, there is a distinctive, and I'm talking about in the state Senate, there is a distinctive leftward shift in the Assembly. Marcos Crespo stepped down, and Carmen Arroyo will no longer be there, and Michael Blake will no longer be there. Chantel Jackson, Kenny Burgos, and Amanda Septimo will take their places. I think for us in the Bronx, it would be hard not to notice a distinct, quote unquote, progressive leftward shift in the New York State Assembly.
Yeah, I think you're seeing the same thing happening in the Assembly that you're seeing in the state Senate. There's an influx of young progressive lawmakers coming in, displacing a lot of, relatively older classic liberals in Queens, in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, some of them backed by the local chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, some just generally rising from a grassroots movement on the political left. And, it's also worth noting that a lot of upstate, relatively moderate Democrats might not be coming back to the state capitol in 2021. And just like in the state Senate, fewer moderates mean that the power of the political left will be relatively stronger within the Assembly conference as well as the state Senate conference.
Yeah, I think we're certainly seeing that in the Bronx. I mean, you and I have not talked about the congressional delegation in the Bronx, but you're going to take out Elliot Engel and Jose Serrano, who was certainly considered progressive, and replace him with Jamal Bowman and Richie Torres. Anyway, Zach Williams, we really appreciate your time. It's really important. You know what I do for a living, and I really feel strongly that, and BronxNet certainly feels strongly about educating voters about what's going on. And you guys at City and State are top of the line. You got to say hello to my friend Ralph Ortega, who I know from his days at the Daily News, is the new editor-in-chief up there. I think one day don't tell him, but one day we will have him on the show, I'm sure. Anyway, Zach, thank you so much. Say hello to Jeff and Rebecca and all my friends over there. And we appreciate your time this evening.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great, no problem. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll go to city limits, talk about some of the larger issues. We can talk about some of the local races, but we're going to get to our buddy Jarrett Murphy and talk about the national scene and some of the implications for culture and our cultures and society. We'll do that right after break. The Bronx Buzz, don't go away.
We know that people are dealing with the health crisis, but there's also a lot of food insecurity.
We're giving out healthy food options, and that's what's key here.
If you're a senior, you have a disability, they'll actually deliver meals to you.
The residents are anxious, they're worried, they're scared, they want to be tested.
When things were happening in our community and we couldn't get the help.
There's almost a presumption of criminality that attaches to your skin color.
The site will prioritize those who are at highest risk in the population.
If you feel symptoms and you'd like to visit one of these COVID-19 testing sites here in the Bronx, you may call the State Health Department's hotline.
Important to note about this site is no reservations are needed. This is a walk-in clinic.
A lot of us are out of work and looking for something to do.
We have the machinery and the skills to make large scales of these masks and gowns.
Take care of your people. It's going to go way further than we actually can understand.
Right now, employees like myself are just adjusting to the new reality.
Reporting from Bronxnet, this is Jarrett Murphy.
Okay, back with you on the Bronx Buzz, and it is my pleasure to welcome back to the program Jarrett Murphy. He's becoming a regular. Jarrett Murphy, the editor of City Limits, and we like that. Nice to have you with us, Jarrett.
Very glad to be a regular, Gary. I'm honored.
Yeah, well, I guess this is now again. I mentioned earlier we're recording this Wednesday, and who knows what can happen by Thursday. But at this moment, it would appear that Joe Biden has the pathway to become the 46th president of the United States. Do you want to just add some personal observations of what you saw last night on election night, and where we're at today, and then we'll pursue it.
Well, I spent all election day in Staten Island because that's the only place where there are contested races. Obviously, you had the Max Rose, Nicole Niatakis congressional race, a couple of assembly races too that I thought were going to be competitive. I spent the day for the most part in southern Staten Island. We had someone else covering the north, and so this was Trump country. You saw a lot of passion for him, a lot of the get out the vote effort that Republicans are basically crediting for why the president appears to have been able to, if not win the race, at least defy pollsters in terms of, the margin, if not nationally, certainly in some of these states. Fairly well organized effort of people present at the polls. Obviously, this was an election being conducted in COVID-19, so there are almost no handbills, very little reason to touch someone else, but people holding posters and stuff. Other thing that occurred to me just quickly is that for all the fears about how this was going to go, things seem to go very, very smoothly. Every poll site coordinator I talked to said there basically were no problems. I think obviously part of that was early voting taking some of the volume away. It was a steady stream of people, but the technology worked, the lists worked. So things I think went smoothly, and there were no signs of any discord or violence or anything like that. So I think whatever the results are or aren't, depending on where you sit, at least the election itself as a process seemed to function fairly well.
Let's focus on that Nicole Malliotakis and Max Rose race. Listen, we're not talking from Staten Island, but all you had to do was have cable television, and you could see the ads were just absolutely vile in both directions. I mean, this was a hard fought. Do you think number one, was it Trump coattails? Was it the fact that she was a mayoral candidate and got some high profile there that did Max Rose in, or do you think it was something else, something that he didn't have enough credibility as a legislator?
Well, it's an extraordinary race. I mean, it was incredibly nasty. The dynamics were bizarre. Both candidates trying to suggest the other was good, close friends with Bill de Blasio. Obviously talking about how much they each loved Donald Trump, or at least were able to work with him. And Max Rose spent a ton of money in that race, $7.3 million to Malliotakis is 2.7, so totally outspent her, but appears to have lost, at least at this hour. It would be very tight, even if all the absentee ballots went his way. I feel as though it's the Trump coattails all the way. I mean, Malliotakis did make a name for herself. She's known on the island. She's been an assemblywoman for many years now. And she has, provided constituent services and that kind of thing. But it's obviously a Republican district for much of its recent history. Rose knocked off a Republican 2 years ago who had been in for quite some time. There really are very few breaks recently in the Republican lineage in that district, but it's the Trump coattails. I think, Rose, the reason he had all that money was he knew he was going to get swept up in that. And that's why he tried to suggest that he was not like other Democrats, that he could work with Trump. But the fact was, what you could see Gary out there physically in the signs and people's sentiments was that Max Rose was never going to shake the fact that he was not from Trump's party, that he was not Trump's candidate. Trump didn't endorse him. Rose voted to impeach Trump. The fact that he tried to have it both ways, I think, might have harmed him. I think he might have done well, and this is easy to say in retrospect, to have simply abandoned Donald Trump and instead make a stronger case for Biden and hope to get more of those people out to also vote for him.
Right. What I found fascinating, and we're going to see this on some level, and that's a whole other deal on the national level, but he refused to concede at this point. And, I don't know that the numbers justify it. I glanced at them and I was like, you know what? He's going to, it's like one of these waiting for the absentee and the military ballots, but he's got to get them all.
He's got to get them all. I mean, there are a lot of races speaking today on Wednesday evening where there is the margin between the leader and the trailer is well within the number of outstanding absentee ballots. That's true in a lot of these state Senate races. some of the assembly races that are close. But in that race, Rose is down about 37,000 votes. And there are some 46,000 absentee ballots out. Only about 31,000 have come in. He says he thinks there might be another 10,000 out there that will still come in, and they can come in for a few days in New York as long as they're postmarked properly and still be counted. They would need to break almost 100% his way. It's very unlikely, but I guess stranger things have happened, and so he figures, what the heck? I mean, I'm either going to retire in 3 days or now. Might as well wait. Yeah. So he'll play his time.
You wrote in your analysis, which frankly was very, very thorough, and as always, and I always appreciate it because I learn a lot. And you talked about the Republican ground game, which clearly played, and you've already addressed that in Staten Island. I spoke to a reporter from Florida who said the same thing. He said, the Democrats had no ground game in Florida. They just allowed whatever Donald Trump was saying or whatever the Republicans were saying to stand, and they knocked on, and this was a quote, maybe 50,000 doors in one of the counties in Florida, whereas the Democrats couldn't say that they did that. And then after we do this, we're going to look at a national picture. What do you think about that? Did you get that sense that they were more organized and better fit to run these competitive races?
I think that might have been part of it. I do feel like Democrats were more likely to be concerned about the pandemic, and for that reason, maybe shying away from some of the traditional GOTV stuff, like having people greet folks at subway stations and go door to door. I know for many people in many states, in New York as well, there was an aversion to do that among Democrats, and I think a little less so among Republicans. I think they were more likely to say, what the heck, I'm going to knock on a door and talk to a voter. So I do think that was part of it. And I think we're going to see for the next, regardless of who wins the presidential race, we're going to see these kind of postmortems for a while. They're already breaking out on social media. Obviously, was it the GOTV effort? Was it Biden as a candidate? Was it that the party was seen as going too far to the left? Was it foreign interference? And you'll find people adopting one or many variables as the explanation.
I'm going to propose this. I put it out on my own social media pages. You might have seen that I said this. To me, if things hold as they are, and I'm not going to preclude, you'd be foolish. Anybody would be foolish to do that at this moment. But if things go as they are, the moment at 4 a.m. when it was announced that the Milwaukee ballots were being counted, and that's what switched Wisconsin from Trump ahead to Biden ahead, was maybe the turning point of this election. And then, of course, Michigan and Detroit came in, and that started to work. And now, of course, there's still talk about the late counting of ballots in Atlanta. My theory here is that you can call it Black Lives Matter, but you can call it people in urban places were just fed up with Donald Trump. And those votes, those people who said, we're going to mail in, we're going to early vote, we're just going to march to the polls and take care of ourselves, is potentially what made this election potentially for Joe Biden. And that, if that's true, would speak to the best tenets of democracy, that this is what democracy is about. If people were motivated to go to the polls, even when you're talking about, tens of millions of votes, those couple of thousand votes, those 100,000 votes in Atlanta or wherever it is, actually potentially have turned the United States of America. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think it's really exciting to think about that. I mean, obviously that's democracy at its most powerful. It has a lot to do with the electoral college, which is maybe not the best system, as we're perhaps seeing again. But yeah, I mean, I think if you look at a map of any recent election, really over the past 20 years, the Democrats have become increasingly the urban and suburban party, and you see that tight concentration, that dark blue on these county by county maps of the states. And those maps are deceiving because it makes it look like, the red is totally washing out the blue. But of course, land doesn't vote. And so you have these large rural areas with relatively low population density, and then these cities that are intensely Democratic. That is the orientation that has been predominant, certainly during the Obama races. And it's what Democrats have increasingly relied on. And I think that, it's certainly where the party's present is, and largely the future too. And I think we'll be seeing, certainly in Pennsylvania, which is at this hour still outstanding, it was all about Philadelphia. And really, it long has been getting a 500,000 vote margin out of Philadelphia to wash out what Republicans are going to do in the rest of the state is apparently basically the Democratic playbook.
And this goes back to what we talked about a ground game. And I had the same conversation with another reporter who said, the Democrats, in order to win the election this year, had to flip some of the Trump states. They never went to Oklahoma or Iowa or those places and knocked on those doors and said, wait a minute, if we did do, you don't even have to call it a Green New Deal, but turned into wind energy and created a factory in your community, all of you people would get jobs, your farms would be healthier, and they could have made a bit of a sale, but they never attempted that kind of ground game and just conceded that whole swath of Central America, if you will, to the Republicans. I think from a political point of view, it's not good strategy. I think you needed to go in there and say, we have something to offer you.
That's exactly right.
Goes back to Hillary and deplorables.
Exactly. Writing people off is always a bad idea. It's immoral and it's bad strategy. And I feel like when you do that, you also make it easy for your opponent because he knows he doesn't have to defend that territory. And, I think finding a message that could work in rural America makes a lot of sense. It's not a lot of votes necessarily, but there's a certain cultural and symbolic value to that. This is what we see as traditional America, even though obviously America is a lot of different things. So I agree with that. And I think there was some talk about trying to fashion a progressive rural program. And the Democrats just didn't do that. There's always a choice, as you know, Gary, campaigns make between the race that they would like to run and the race they feel they can run. And the Democrats thought that they had to basically stick to home cooking, find votes where they had always been, drive those counts up, and wait till another year to try to develop more of a 50-state strategy.
And they had the pandemic and Black Lives Matter to fuel those extra votes, as we have just recounted. Jarrett Murphy, it's a shame we have the pandemic, because I would tell you we got to go sit at a coffee shop and we could do about 2 hours on this, but our time for this evening is up, and it's always great to have you with us.
Very glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Gary.
Great. We're going to say goodnight for you. And Bronx Talk, we're going to have a panel discussion about what the heck is going on in America. That will be this week on Bronx Talk. So thanks to Jarrett Murphy. Thanks to Zach Williams from City and State. And we'll see you. Good night. Stay safe, please.